So let's talk about what's doing well for the Tyranids in 10th edition Warhammer 40k, with a look at some of the strongest army lists from the swarms from beyond the galaxy. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of some of the strongest lists that the faction can bring to bear, and take a look over a few of the units, detachments and options that some of the best players around are using to get to the top. Currently in Warhammer 40k, the Tyranids are kind of sort of lower end power wise, but not one of the single most struggling factions in the game. They are an interesting army that does have several options of ways to play. People make use of several different detachments. Though it has to be said that at the top end of play they do seem to be struggling. They've got win rates of around about 46% since the balanced data slate, which isn't awful to be fair, but they haven't actually taken down any event wins since the data slate at all, even though it does look like a couple of people managed to go undefeated. And that is actually kind of surprising given how popular they are. It seems that they're around about the third or fourth most played faction in grand tournaments at the moment, so just by weight of numbers you would kind of expect that some people will be getting to the top with that kind of play rate. I guess the Tyranids do have lots more players these days due to being the launch faction of 10th edition, which might be skewing the numbers just a little bit. I suspect that maybe not quite as many people will be playing them if they hadn't received so much love, attention and cool stuff recently. To achieve this success at tournaments, it seems that the most played Hive fleet is Invasion Fleet at the moment. It does seem pretty successful and grants some pretty nice damage and defensive buffs, perhaps seeming that that's the thing that Tyranids are most needing out of anything. Easy access to that 5+ feel no pain and things like lethal hits against monsters and vehicles when they need it. Otherwise, out of the detachments, Vanguard Onslaught, Unending Swarm and Synaptic Nexus all see at least some play competitively, and they all seem to do at least okay as well, maybe Unending Swarm in particular being a bit weirdly disproportionate on the top tables from time to time, can just be a bit of a strange spoiler list that a lot of people aren't ready for. Following the points updates from the balanced data slate, I did feel like Games Workshop at least managed to make a few more things a bit more interesting again in game, with big drops to things like Screamer Killers and the Tyrannifex. It still does seem that quite a lot of staples are just present in most Tyranid lists. Deathleaper and the Neurotyrants seem to be the most common things in the HQ section. Most armies run at least some Gargoyles, given their big move, shoot, move and objective disruption. Biovores are a common staple to just hoover out some spore mines and basically auto-complete some secondary objectives. Neurolictors are really quite good for objective play, even if they went up in points a bit, still seems they're seen as well worthwhile. And for mainline damage dealers, the two most common things seem to be Exocrines and Maleceptors with their big hitting damage 3 weapons, maybe supported by things like Screamer Killers, Old Worn Iron Carnifexes, or a few others. Let's take a look at a few of the top Tyranid lists around though, with a look at a few of the players who have managed to take them to victory, or gone 4-1 at a big tournament since the data slate came out. Taking a look at best coast pairings, one list I saw was this one by Marek Vinker, who used it to take second at the Ogre Cub Singles, a Czech event I believe, and used this Invasion Fleet army to go 5-0 against a field of 53 players. Invasion Fleet really does seem to remain a staple of Tyranid's competitive play. You get that big adaptive ability that you get at the start of the game, either getting lethal hits against monsters and vehicles, or sustained hits against infantry, helping punish enemies that skew too hard to any one thing, and beyond that I'd argue that the most powerful stratagem is their 5+ feel no pain one. That one's a battle tactic, which means that you can have it just pop up on one unit, and it does make people tempted to run a Hive Tyrant as well, as there's one here, as that means that you can have the Feel No Pain on 2 different units, or potentially use some other tricks if it makes more sense. In this list we've got the Sneaky Infiltrator that is Deathleaper. He is joined by 2 Neurolictors as well, tough lone operatives that can be tricksy and skirmishing on objectives. There's a Neurotyrant, which boosts the Shadow in the Warp and is often left on backfield objectives in my experience. It has some good overwatch that can make it quite good for defending any interlopers on the home territory. The Hive Tyrant takes a Venom Cannon and Bone Sword with Adaptive Biology. I believe that's the one that allows you a little bit extra durability. A 5+ feel no pain all the time, raising up to a 4+ if you take some damage. I think you still want to play kind of cagey with him and not have him shot down too easily though. He is a bit of a linchpin target that people might want to go after. There's 2 units of 10 Gargoyles, fast moving objective control chaff. They can be interesting with their move shoot move from Deep Strike as well. 1 Biovore to farm out those spawn mines and do secondaries. 2 Pyrovores, which can be quite nice little placeholder sort of units, doing screening in the backfield and maybe threatening to do secondaries and things like that. And then all that is leading up to a big battery of Tyranid monstrous creatures, 3 Exocrines with their heavy bioplasma attacks, 3 Maleceptors with their Psychic Blast plus a Trigon. I feel like the Exocrines and Maleceptors are fairly standard mainline damage dealers for the Tyranids these days. The Trigon's perhaps a bit more interesting. Kind of a fun option that can just turn up anywhere that's greater than 3 inches away from the enemy and cause some problems. Potentially can be good for secondary objectives, can be a really disruptive thing with rapid ingress as well if it goes somewhere that it shouldn't. Overall, really quite a cool list. Plenty of objective scoring things with Gargoyles, Biovores, and Neurolictors and Deathleaper to disrupt the enemy, plus a pretty massive amount of damage. Enemy Terminators and Custodians wouldn't want to get in the way of that sort of firepower. Focusing on the big damage dealers for this list, the Exocrine and the Maleceptors do seem to be very common throughout lots of Tyranid armies. The Maleceptor's the more expensive of the two, 170 points for 14 wounds worth of toughness 11 monster with its 4+ invulnerable save with its psychic shield. It's perhaps a particularly nice one to have on the front lines with that good durability, plus if you're within 6 inches of it, then you're -1 to the hit roll. That makes it particularly sturdy in close combat, and it could even get up to -1 to wound if it targets half-strength enemies. Its big psychic attack is d6 plus 3 shots at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3, really quite general purpose, particularly in invasion fleets where if you're against all vehicles you might be getting lethal hits against them. Perhaps loitering a bit further back are the Exocrines typically, 135 points for another fairly scary amount of shooting, 36-inch range and d6 plus 3 shots at strength 8, AP 3 and damage 3. Pretty standout versus elite infantry and certainly has enough volume to threaten vehicles too. Not quite as hard to kill as the Maleceptors without that big invulnerable save, and it won't like close combat, but really quite a cheap and effective Tyranid big gun turret. Plus once you hit one thing, then other Tyranids can reroll hit rolls of 1 against that same thing, so it can be pretty solid to mark other units for Tyranid shooting later in the phase. These guys really do seem to be staples of Tyranid damage dealing. Literally all the lists I've featured today included at least one of each. Next up for the second list, I noticed there was a Synaptic list that did kind of well at the Warhammer 40k GT, I believe the one in Nottingham. This one run by a Paddy Baron. The Synaptic Nexus is the one that gives you buffs nearby your Synapse creatures. It gives you a +1 to hit in close combat, a +1 to advance and charge, and a 5+ invulnerable save, all on different turns, as well as a few other fun options like a fairly punchy damage boost when enemies fail Battle Shock. And perhaps my favourite one is that Irresistible Will stratagem, where you have one enemy unit nominated within 24 inches, and then he gets to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1 against that target for everything within 6 inches of your Synapse beastie. That one can be pretty good with Zoanthropes. I noticed there are a couple of squads of them hovering around here. Having that trigger off with all their anti-tank shooting could be a good way just to say goodbye to a big enemy vehicle threat. It looks like we've got a Hive Tyrant again, who could trigger that as that's a battle tactic stratagem. He's got Synaptic control to keep him a bit more safe with -1 damage. And otherwise there's the Deathleaper, a Neurotyrant, and the Wings Prime with the Dirge Heart of Charis. That's one that worsens the enemy battle shock tests, which could be really quite interesting in combination with Deathleaper and a couple of Neurolictors. There's a lot of options here to make the enemy fail battle shock, particularly with the Neurotyrant debuffing the shadow in the warp for a turn. And that could be fun to double down and hand out some mortal wounds with smothering shadow. With the Neurolictors about as well, any failed battle shock tests would mean that you could be +1 to wound against those targets with their boost, so quite a lot of cool stuff there. Beyond that, there's 3 Raveners with thorax weapons for some nice strong anti-infantry clearing there, 1 Ripper Swarm and 1 Biovore to help with secondary objectives, a single Lictor that could just start on the board as another lone operative or could do rapid ingress things, 1 Exocrine and 1 Maleceptor for some mainline damage dealing, 2 Screamer Killers, which are again another way of handing out a battle shock test. This army does really have a very interesting amount of battle shock shenanigans, and then finally 1 Norn Emissary, another great big Synaptic brute that can be pretty good with that reroll 1s to hit and wound stratagem just in itself, but it's just very very tough and hard to kill off midfield objectives where it will get loads of objective control. Overall this one looks really fun, looks like it's playing battle shock Tyranids to the max, and it would look very satisfying with those Neurolictors about to maybe get +1 to wound on those enemies. Talking about the Synaptic Nexus, it makes sense that we focus on the brain bugs for the Tyranids. The Neurotyrant is 105 points and again is a massive competitive staple. Compared with regular Hive Tyrants, it's incredibly cheap and not really that much threat. For its cheap cost though, it is at least fairly tough with 9 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable save, and it helps out in 3 different ways beyond that. It gets better Synapse with a really long range, which is kind of helpful for Synaptic Nexus in particular. It helps out Shadow in the Warp by making enemies -1 to the battle shock test for that, making the core faction mechanic just really quite a lot more reliable there. It'll often change units from failing the test on a 6 to a 7 or on a 5 to a 6. Finally, if any enemies do get too close, it has its Psychic Scream, 2d6 attacks at Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 2 with Torrent, so it's quite a nice Overwatch threat, and people often tend to park them on backfield objectives where they're safe, knowing that if the enemy does try and step up and destroy it, it can probably scream them to death. Otherwise, definitely worth talking about the Neurolictor in this one. Neurolictors are 80 points now, having gone up from the crazily undercosted 65 that they were, but they're still seeing massive competitive play. They're a fairly tanky lone operative with a 4+ invulnerable save and 7 wounds. Their melee damage might make a mess of a few 1-wound infantry, but isn't enormously exciting for the cost at strength 6 and damage 1, but their big things are their battle shock tricks. In your command phase, you can select one enemy unit within 12 inches to take a battle shock test, and as it's done in your command phase, it could influence what objectives your opponent can deny you. You could potentially just take them off an objective in the midfield if they fail that test. Otherwise, when battle shock tests get handed out and they do fail it, enemies get to be -1 to hit, and perhaps more importantly, friendly Tyranids get +1 to wound against that battle shocked unit. Really quite massive if they can make something fail nearby. Then it means the rest of your army can potentially focus that target. In that list, you could potentially be getting that +1 to wound really quite a lot, between things like the Screamer Killers handing out further tests, and the Winged Prime and Deathleaper making tests more likely. Never mind the Neurotyrants' Big Shadow in the Warp once per game. Often these might want to be parked in cover where they can't be attacked particularly well, but making sure they're within range of an objective to hand out those tests when needed. Moving on to our third list, and here we have an Unending Swarm list, this one run by Richard Kilpatrick, who used it to take 5th at Battlefield Birmingham, going 4-1 at an 80-player tournament. Unending Swarm does seem to be a bit of a good spoiler list, kind of rarely played due to the model commitments and the fact that it doesn't do enormous amounts of damage, but does have some really quite fun board control and disruption tricks. When your models get shot, they can potentially pile towards the enemy, which could be really disruptive if you're scrapping over midfield objectives, as units might just jump straight into combat with enemy squads. And I've got that big recycler unit stratagem, where if you have one of your Endless Multitude squads destroyed, you can put them back into reserve, maybe particularly nice with Gargoyles, where they could be swooping down anywhere on the map, and then also get their move shoot move as a secondary move. For an Unending Swarm list, this one definitely goes heavy on the hordes, but also doesn't skimp on some actual damage as well. Kind of nice to think that you do have some really big threats to take down tough stuff, but also a regenerating horde of nasties to get in the enemy's way and score the objectives. There's the omnipresent Deathleaper and the Neurotyrant in the character section. For the swarms, we've got a big unit of 20 Gargoyles, one small unit of 10 of them, 20 Hormagaunts that run very fast at you and get to advance and charge, 3 units of Termagants taking the Spine Fists and the Strangle Web Launcher. Spine Fists often tend to be the way to go for them, given that they get to re-roll the wound roll and get the pistol keyword, means they can still be some threat in close combat if tied up. There's 2 units of Chaff 11 Eurogaunts, which are pretty nice to hold the backfield and tie up space, and then some standard issue Tyranid objective support with 1 Biovore and 2 Neurolictors. Backing them all up though, as mentioned, there is some serious damage dealing, 3 Exocrines that could make a big mess of elite infantry, 2 Maleceptors for some muscle on the front line, and there's also the Tyranids armed with an acid spray as well. Not too surprised to see them being used a little bit more. A really big and tough Tyranid biotank for the cost, with the threat of a very strong Overwatch to melt some Space Marines if they get a bit too aggressive in the midfield. For this one I thought it might make sense to focus on the Gargoyles, as fairly godly Tyranid objective securing chaff. They move 12 inches with objective control 2, which is just pretty good in itself, as that means that you can get loads of scoring onto the midfield points from a long distance away and flip objectives. They can ping out a few flesh borer shots as they do that, which can also fire when they advance due to the assault keyword. And then their Winged Swarm special rule means that they get to make a normal move of 6 inches after they've shot. There's lots of ways that Gargoyles can be a massive amount of use. You could potentially just use them to play move shoot move games on the midfield objectives. You could use a big 20 model unit to do a fairly devastating move block on the enemy turn 1. Move 12, advance d6, shoot, and then move another 6 inches, meaning that you should be able to get right up to the enemy front lines. Certain armies that don't have fly or the movement to go around you, they're not going to thank you for being trapped in their own deployment zone turn 1, particularly for a squad in this list where they can just respawn if the opponent wipes them all. Otherwise they can be fun out of deep strike as well, deep striking down 9 inches away and then using that move shoot move to get them far closer. It means they might be able to get places where they really shouldn't be able to and score primaries or secondaries. Another staple in most of these lists are the Biovores, really nice utility for 75 points. Only one of them can spawn a Spore Mine each turn now, but that's all you need to basically guarantee you a fair few more victory points. Spore Mines can still do secondary type objectives like behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers and things like that, so a Biovore can throw one of these out where it's most needed, do the action and stay safe in itself. If it doesn't need to, it can contribute a little bit of chip indirect damage fire with devastating wounds, and on turn 1 it can be particularly important as well to stop enemies advancing onto midfield objectives. Just throwing one out there could really disrupt the plans of a squad that was planning to advance to that midfield point, could literally deny you victory points to your opponent right then and there. Finally, from shortly after the data slate dropping, this list was by John Lennon, who used it to take second at the Grand Onslaught Grand Tournament, going undefeated against a tournament of just under 60 players, and this one was an Invasion Fleet list that goes nice and heavy on the Carnifexes. Like the first Invasion Fleet list, this one has the Hive Tyrant with adapted biology to hand out some nice feel no pain type saves. Forgot to mention it when we talked about the first Invasion Fleet, but it's also really quite important for the Tyranid firepower units. It means things like Exocrines and Maleceptors can advance and shoot, and that can be really quite big for getting lines of sight. In this one as well, there's an interesting old One-Eye unit, old One-Eye backed up by 2 Carnifexes with full Death Spitters. Old One-Eye's a regenerating monstrosity that's a very efficient melee damage in his own right, but he gets 2 reroll hit rolls for his Carnifex brood with really quite a lot of shooting here. Otherwise, there's 3 units of 10 Gargoyles for their rather great objective scoring, 1 Biovore for objective things, 1 Pyrovore for some nice cheap board filling, and 2 of the staple Neurolictors. Then kind of fun, there's 2 Screamer Killer Carnifexes as well for a bit more battle shock and big damage 3 melee muscle. Again, it's really nice to see them in a place where they're getting play. The Screamer Killer does seem to be efficient enough at 145 points. Here is its stat line. Toughness 9 with 10 wounds and a 2+ save I think is now okay durability. It was definitely sorely lacking when it was costed up at like 170 points or more. Its Psychic Scream is pretty effective against enemy lighter infantry in the shooting phase, a whole load of attacks against Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 1 with Assault. That one hands out that Battle Shock test as mentioned, subtracting 1 from the test, which is often a bit meh if it's on your turn in other armies, but if you've got Neurolictors around it could be really big. Otherwise, when it hits home, it hits hard with those Screamer Killer Talons, massively general purpose melee at Strength 10, AP 2 and Damage 3, very nasty against enemy Terminator equivalents in particular. Finally, though not present in the last list, I sort of feel like we had to talk about the King of the Tyranids himself in the Deathleaper. He generally still seems to be an auto-include in the vast majority of Tyranid competitive lists. 80 points for a tanky lone operative with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. Fairly standard sort of lictor melee with 6 attacks at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2 with precision. Fights first to make him very difficult to remove for enemies trying to charge him. And on top of that, there's yet more battle shock shenanigans with fear of the unseen. When an enemy unit's within 6 inches, their leadership goes down, and they also have to test battle shock if they've taken any damage whatsoever. Quite nice to have on midfield objectives when you're skirmishing with enemies. It still seems to be considered well worth having around. Good melee with fights first, very tanky for a disruptive lone operative, and the objective thing is genuinely handy enough and could occasionally deny your opponent primaries. In any case, hope you've enjoyed a quick look at a few Tyranid top lists. Let me know your thoughts on them down in the comments below, or any other insights as to how they were played. Obviously they weren't my armies, so I'm sure I'm missing some subtleties of how they get put on the table. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.